Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name is Fred Wheeler and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. And the topic for today is Dungeon Masters not speaking in different voices or different NPC voices is a lazy practice. And I want to break this down because when I say different voices, it's often viewed as a different accent. You're changing the way your voice sounds. The title of this video is quite unfortunate. It is in fact an attitude and opinion some people playing Dungeons and Dragons express and believe. And I want to address this particular topic even if it seems a little bit painful. So stay with me and I will explain myself. It's become a prevailing belief by many members of the Dungeons and Dragons community that if a dungeon master who's playing the game and running a game can't or doesn't use different voices or speak in an accent, then they are not a very good dungeon master. In fact, that is often viewed as being quite lazy on their part. And if they're not using a voice, they absolutely should be working towards doing this. This really frustrates me. As a dungeon master who's been running games for many years and somebody who has helped other dungeon masters become a dungeon master or play Dungeons and Dragons just as a player, it really frustrates me when I hear this sort of thing. Not only that, it actually makes me quite angry. And I want to make it clear that I do have a particular opinion of the concept of using different voices in Dungeons and Dragons. I have used different voices in my game in the past, for anybody who was wondering. It certainly has happened. The quickest way to scare people off and frighten them away from the role of being a dungeon master in a Dungeons and Dragons game is to insist and expect them to operate like a voice actor and to be able to change their voice and use accents and different voices for the NPCs. It's actually quite a difficult process to go through. And I really don't like that. I don't like the idea that we're going to wind up with people not picking up the mantle of being a dungeon master. I think that's a bad thing. I think that is something we want to avoid doing. The Dungeons and Dragons community needs more dungeon masters, not fewer dungeon masters. If we were looking for fewer dungeon masters, that would mean we had a surplus of them. And we don't have a surplus of dungeon masters in the community. In fact, we don't have enough. That's a simple fact. It's been going on like this even as the popularity of Dungeons and Dragons 5e progresses. The problem doesn't really go away. It's always there. Now, granted, Dungeon Masters for years, well before live streaming, well before Dungeons and Dragons became quite popular, and it has become quite popular, have been using different accents and different voices in their games. And in fact, many very good or great Dungeon Masters have never used an accent or voices in their games. And it didn't hurt their game, and it didn't detract from their game in any way. So what's going on here and what is the issue? It's actually quite a narrow perspective to consider that a dungeon master needs to alter the way their voice sounds when they're playing a non-player character or monster or an NPC, and to view it as lazy. Now, I'm not going to dispute that it is a lazier form of operating as a dungeon master, because to actually learn how to do that requires a lot of effort. So I'm not going to dispute that. Okay, I think that's legit. But is that a bad thing? I don't actually think it is a bad thing. I think it actually makes an awful lot of sense. And I'm going to explain myself near the end of the video. There's actually nothing wrong with just role-playing an NPC or monster in the first person, but not changing your voice, or in the third person. You don't have to modify your voice to actually role-play a character. Isn't it strange that we have many actors who play different characters in movies, and yet they've never changed their voice, and they are able to portray themselves as a different character and there's no alteration of the way their voice sounds. They use their standard voice, and they just role play the character as if they are that individual. Now, I'm not necessarily saying you have to be able to do that. This is not what this video is about. It has nothing to do with what you have to do and what you should do. It's about, is it actually necessary to get the message across and have a good time playing Dungeons & Dragons and make it entertaining and interesting for your players? And I think actually, no. I think it can be done. You do not need to change your voice. You could say that the current trend of live stream games, such as Critical Role and Acquisitions Incorporated, and MCDM, so that's Matthew Colville Distracts Me, are responsible for focusing on voices, but actually it has nothing to do with them whatsoever. Actually, it has far more to do with the audience driving that expectation, because it's very entertaining. Dungeons & Dragons has become like a spectator sport to a large degree. So it's got nothing to do with Matthew Mercer, or Chris Perkins, or Jeremy Crawford, or Mike Mills. Has nothing to do with Matthew Colville, nothing to do with them whatsoever. It has everything to do with the audience watching that sort of thing on the live streams. That's what's driving that. Do we want to go and blame the Dungeons & Dragons YouTubers that are giving Dungeon Master advice? Well, you don't actually have to listen to what they're saying. You don't have to listen to what they are communicating to you. It is really up to you how you approach and deal with that information when it's presented to you. So I just want to make that clear, that a lot of this actually falls back on your own perspective and interpretation of what's going on and what's a good thing to do and what's important. Yes, I absolutely agree that players find it far more entertaining when you do a voice. But if you can't do a voice, I don't actually think that's a bad thing. Now, here's the reason and rationale that I have for you. Okay? It's clearly obvious that a lot of people like a Dungeon Master who will change the way their voice sounds. It's the flashy bit to being a Dungeon Master. It's the flashy thing you can do. But is it actually the most important aspect of role-playing an NPC? And honestly, I don't think it is. I think actually a lot of people get lost on that particular aspect. So here's why I think you should not worry about role-playing and using different voices or accents. This is completely my own opinion, and I understand if you want to just leave it, that's fine. But I don't think it's the most important aspect to role-playing any kind of NPC. It places quite a lot of extra strain on your voice. Now, everybody is different. The way their voice operates means that they only have a particular range that they can work with. Most Dungeon Masters who do a voice can only do a small range, maybe between 4 or 5 relatively different voices, and as they're placing strain on their voice box to change the way it sounds, because that's what's taking place, that's actually putting stress on them, their voice will start to slowly but surely get weaker and weaker and weaker. And you can't maintain it. I've found when I've done voices in the past, and I know a lot of Dungeon Masters find exactly the same thing, is you can't maintain it for a long period of time. There'll be a certain word or a certain series or sequence of words that you try to say, trying to maintain that accent or voice, and it breaks. Somewhere along the line, you can't maintain it. It requires a very skilled individual to be able to do that. So the repertoire and the range of voices you're communicating with, if you do an accent or voice, is fairly small. It's not a huge range, and it does put a lot of extra strain, which means you're going to have to drink a lot of water. You're really going to have to look after yourself. You're going to have to probably use a few tips and tricks to repair the damage that's done to your voice. In other words, you're going to have to stop speaking for a while so that your voice box actually recovers. So those are the most extreme aspects, certainly, I agree. But it is still a process where often when you've been doing voices, you have to sort of stop using your voice to help it recover. It requires significant training and understanding about how to look after your voice box, and voice actors have gone through this training process. Most dungeon masters will never go through this process. They certainly will never have the time, because it takes years. It takes quite a lot of time to actually develop that skill so you can look after your voice. And you know what's funny is that even individuals on the Critical Role team and who do voices, I have seen their voices crack. They'll put on a particular voice, they can't maintain it, and suddenly it gets lost. Suddenly it falls out of the range that they had set up, and so then they've got to speak a lot less. So it happens to even the most significant and well-trained individuals within the industry with regard to voice actors. It's going to wear out your dungeon master a lot faster. And now, when I say, I don't mean wearing out your voice. It's certainly, I've already said that's going to happen. It's going to wear out the dungeon master. They're going to get tired. And when you put on a voice and you change the way your voice sounds, it's actually using up a lot more energy. Not only do you need to focus on how you're communicating, but you have to do it in such a way that you can keep it up. You've also got to think about what the non-player character is going to say. So you're actually using your brain a lot more. You're forcing it to do a whole lot of additional things that actually require a lot of effort on your part. So don't be surprised if your dungeon master can't maintain a session for 4 hours and would prefer to play for only 2 or 3 hours, because that will often happen. I've found that the time frame for me as a dungeon master is getting shorter and shorter. Now I feel like 2 or 3 hours is really about as much as I want to actually run a game for, and I will take the opportunity to let the players communicate between each other rather than spend a lot of time talking myself as a dungeon master. Now, here is the thing that I really want you to focus on, and that is your focus should not be on how you say it, and that's changing your accent, but what the dungeon master says or communicates to their players as the NPC or monster. That's really the most important aspect. I've found that if I focus on changing my voice, I start to find it more difficult to figure out, well, hang on, I now have to improvise. I've constructed a few sort of lines of dialogue or a few things I think the NPC will say beforehand or during the session, but now I've got to work with the fact that I've got to improvise. I've got to work with my players. They might start pulling out a few things that I hadn't planned for, and now I've got to think about, well, how do I communicate that to my players' characters so that they understand, and how do I stay within the parameters of the character that I've set up in the first place, my NPC, because there'll be a whole lot of parameters I've set up, personality traits, bonds, ideals, flaws, motivations, and other aspects that I might have put into my character. And those are very sort of basic aspects to it. I don't want you to worry about changing your voice and doing a different accent if it would deter you from being a dungeon master. I think that's one of the worst things that could possibly happen to our hobby and the community as a whole, if suddenly we start focusing on those aspects rather than the really important stuff. So if it's going to deter you as a dungeon master to be a dungeon master because you feel like you have to do a different voice for all of the NPCs, I think that's a bad thing. It's going to create unnecessary strain and stress on yourself. And it's not just on your voice, it's not just on making you more tired and wearing you out so that the game session will be shorter, because that often will be the case. What you'll find is that all of the butterflies, I don't know if all dungeon masters get this, but I know when I was starting out as a dungeon master, and when I, even after a few years, after I've sort of past the bloodied stage as a dungeon master, I would get the butterflies in the stomach. I don't get the butterflies in the stomach anymore, but it's certainly creating a lot of additional stress that you really don't need to expose yourself to. Now, I think that Matt Colville is a great example of a dungeon master who goes through the process of communicating to their players how an NPC will operate. He works very, very hard on that. But have you noticed that Matt Colville doesn't really change his voice? It's very rare to see that take place. He's focusing more on what the NPC is saying rather than on the way that it is said. And this is something I really want you to understand when it comes to changing your voice and the importance of it. It's not very important, it's the least important aspect. Now, Matt Colville on his channel recently did a video called Roleplaying. I think it's running the game number 83. And if you haven't watched that video, it actually highlights this very topic. And I saw that and I thought, this is the time to try and do this video because he's saying exactly what I've always considered to be an issue with regard to changing your voice. So if you haven't gone and seen his YouTube channel and watched that video, I want you to really consider doing that. It is a fantastic video. It communicates everything really clearly, makes it explicit and clear. Now, I'm hoping that people stayed with the video, and if you found this useful or helpful, I understand if some of you still need time to sort of process this or you disagree with me, that's perfectly fine, I understand. I would say I have hundreds of videos for players and dungeon masters, hundreds of videos that provide you with really practical advice for playing your Dungeons and Dragons game, and you're welcome to go and check them out. I'm sure you will find them useful if you're still with me. Now, if you want to support the channel so I keep doing videos like this, then you can check me out on Patreon, where you can get access to the unlisted live stream videos that I do, additional content, and priority on the video content that I make on my channel. I certainly do that. I also have affiliate links to the book depository and Amazon, where you can buy stuff online and I get a small commission. I have a merchandise shelf underneath all of my videos. Make sure to share, like, and subscribe, and hit the bell button to be notified when I go live and when I publish new videos. And I want to say just a quick call out to Sly Flourish's Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. It is a fantastic book. You can get it as a digital form or as a paperback cover, and certainly it has lots of really smart advice for those of you who are trying to make your life a little bit easier as a dungeon master and don't have gobs of time or huge amounts of skill to actually do things the way that a lot of other dungeon masters are trying to operate their game. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.